So I want to open up this video with a bit of an anecdote, if you will. So bear with me. I want to take us back to August of 2008, where during one of my regular visits to the flea market, I had acquired a used Sega Dreamcast and several games along with it. Among the crop of games I got with the Dreamcast was Fighting Force 2, which was the sequel to Fighting Force, a 3D beat-em-up for the PlayStation. And that was the extent of my familiarity with that particular title. So I go home, I set up the Dreamcast, I try out some of the games, and then I get around to trying out Fighting Force 2, I pop the game into the system, I turn the system on, and the thing doesn't read. It would do the usual, boot up screen before going straight to the Dreamcast menu. Tried cleaning the disc, tried cleaning the lens, didn't work. So this was the one dud in my Dreamcast collection that wouldn't work and was ultimately fated to be a drink coaster. Maybe it was a blessing in disguise, or maybe it was divine intervention, but regardless, I was prevented from the chance to play Fighting Force 2, not only due to the Dreamcast simply refusing to read the disc, but also due to the inconceivable instance where the disc was somehow split in half after having had a dozen coffee cups rested upon it. So to anyone who claimed that this game would make a great coaster, you're all a bunch of liars. Eventually I did acquire another copy of the game, and I kinda wish I hadn't. Fighting Force 2 is an absolutely dreadful video game. Just utterly, revoltingly, unabashedly, embarrassingly, distastefully dreadful. The sad realization is that when I eventually got around to playing the original Fighting Force, initially as a PS1 classic through PlayStation Network on PSP, and eventually getting my hands on an actual game copy itself for the PlayStation, Fighting Force was a pretty competent, semi-decent beat-em-up. Wasn't the greatest thing in the world, but it was alright for what it was. And it was a good starting point for an eventual series where they could have a sequel that would improve on the mechanics and make it a bit better. And instead of doing that, they went with this third-rate action-adventure thing with tank controls, shoddy dark visuals, and cumbersome generic gameplay that happens to fail at every conceivable level, that whoever plays it for any extended period of time slowly starts to lose the will to live. So there's a backstory regarding biochemical experiments or weapons or some other thing. Bad guys doing bad things, and it's up to the Fighting Force comprising one and only one individual to stop. Who gives a shit? The character they stick you with, Hawk, has about as much personality and charisma as a wooden log. Though I may be harsh in that assessment, a wooden log has more charisma and personality than Hawk ever would. Despite the pretense of a game that has you finding keys to open doors and solving puzzles and things of that nature, the levels are pretty linear and aren't quite as open-ended or sophisticated as you're led to believe. You go into a room, you fight bad guys, one of them drops a key, and then you try to find the closest thing resembling a door before moving on to the next segments. Lather, rinse, repeat. Sometimes you'll need to climb ladders, which apparently requires a mastery in black magic to achieve because the controls are just god-awful. You'd figure by 1999 developers would have realized that having human characters control like a tank in three-dimensional video games requiring actions such as jumping and rolling and punching and kicking is a bad idea, but not Core. No, they believed tank controls is exactly what players needed to get some semblance of challenge out of a beat-em-up. A beat-em-up that also happens to feature firearms where one needs to aim at things. Tank controls in a beat-em-up. Jesus Christ. What moron thought that was a good idea? Especially since you can't fight and turn at the same time, which places you at a severe disadvantage when fighting multiple opponents that happens to gang up on you. And this happens more often than not. Yeah, nice going there, dipshits. I suppose it's not all bad. To make up for the slow speed and tank-like controls of your player, your character does have the ability to make everything he touches explode into a ball of flames after a couple of hits. What sense does this make? Absolutely none. Does it help my chances? Of course not. And for some odd reason, the exploding chairs will yield weapons such as pipes and guns, which can be used against your enemies, who are easily subdued by these weapons that are literally laying all over the place. Indeed, your only real difficulty in Fighting Force 2 lies in the awkward controls, the jittery camera, not too bad for large rooms, but problematic in smaller ones, and overly generic gameplay that proves to be a fine test in how long you could fend off boredom. I wish I could say Fighting Force 2 sported some half-decent visuals. The game has the unfortunate habit of taking place in perpetual darkness. Even with some alterations made to the footage when putting this video together, this still looks really dark and shoddy. You could barely make out a thing. And when you could get a good look at the graphics in a brighter setting, they end up looking dull and uninspired. Camera's a bit shoddy at times. There's been instances of the occasional clip up. This is just sad to look at. And this is on the Sega Dreamcast, by the way. A system that I'd imagine could pull off some impressive visuals when the developers could be bothered to give a damn. I shudder to think how the PlayStation version would look as a result. By the way, looking for a game with great sound? Look elsewhere. While the sound quality on Fighting Force 2 is admittedly crisp and clear for the most part, there's very few if any bits of music to be found here, and what's there isn't all that memorable. Sound effects aren't exactly going to wow anybody either. Who cares? I've heard the argument that if Eidos or Core had called this game any other name but Fighting Force 2, reaction to it would have been different, and I wholeheartedly disagree. I don't think giving this game a different name was going to change anyone's opinion of reprehensibly horrible gameplay. Regardless of what name it bears, Fighting Force 2 is just god-awful. Bad enough it abandoned the above-average beat-em-up gameplay of the first game in favor of something ill-suited for this kind of series, but to execute said new ill-fitting style in such an ugly manner is just... Again, I must ask, what moron thought this was a good idea? Anyone looking for a good Dreamcast game should not be picking up Fighting Force 2. Anyone looking for a further fix of Fighting Force should just go back and play the first game again. Anyone looking for a fun activity should just stare at the wall. Yes, staring at a wall is more fun and more engaging than Fighting Force 2. Absolutely terrible.